Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast about API Governance 2.0, a key element for security and scaling API programs. My name is Raymond Peng, and I'm a digital engagement lead at Google. And I'm
Hi.
also joined with Ruben Gonzalez.
Hi, everyone. I'm a customer engineer for Apigee.
Awesome. All right, so before we get started, just a quick few housekeeping items. You're going to see on the console in this webcast on the left, a place where you can put in your queue and questions and answers. You can post your questions at any time during the webcast, but please note that you don't have to wait until the end of the session. You can ask it at any time, and we'll try to answer them either at the end or offline after the webcast. Also, you'll see a resource list on the right. We will post some links and other things within the resource that we mentioned during the webcast, so you can access them as well that way. So let's take a quick look at the agenda for today's webcast. The first thing we're going to talk about is a paradigm shift in API governance. So what is this API Governance 2.0 all about anyways? We're also going to start with creating consistent and security API patterns for APIs and how you can use them to ensure adherence and compliance and standards for your APIs. And then we'll show you how Apigee can help you do that. So the software that applies this API Governance 2.0 concepts as well as the technology. And hopefully that'll help our audience understand how they can build and test APIs much, much faster than they're doing today. So with that being said, let's take a look at kind of where companies are at. You know, a lot of companies have invested in APIs. They might have hundreds or even thousands of APIs. And those who have them are primarily started with this integration method, basically APIs that we're calling system to system. But, you know, with digital disruption, Ruben, you know, so many things have happened in terms of the emergence of cloud, you know, the changing power of the consumer and the emergence of new competitive threats for a lot of different companies in terms of other crossovers that are trying to eat their business away. So, you know, now companies are starting to use the APIs in a much more expansive way. They are integrating with partners, so they're going external, they're putting them on the cloud, and they're using them to monetize and actually find new sources of revenue, so really transformative. But in the end, so now you've got, maybe you had 10, 100, or 1,000 APIs, but now they were all internal, but now they're also external, right? And so that creates, you know, this concern that you have all these APIs, you know, in your organization, internal and external, but at the same time, you still got to go fast. And there's that concern about security. So there's sort of this balance, right, in terms of, well, I got to go fast. I need to be competitive, but how can I get this speed?
That's right. So, and we usually see this happening too often, right? So now organizations are thinking of security as an afterthought rather than something that need to be prioritized, even before thinking of which capabilities they're going to start exposing through APIs, right? They're getting all this pressure from their competition. They need to deliver as fast as possible. However, well, you see, all these security issues are not being addressed correctly, and then surprise, now they're being attacked, or now some malicious user found a vulnerability, and now they're using all their data for malicious purposes. So yeah, this is happening too often. So how did we come to this place, right? How did come to happen? And well, it's pretty simple, right? So organizations, they wanted to innovate really fast, right? However, it's not as simple as just exposing some digital asset through an API. Yeah, of course, they need to deliver all these new experiences as fast as possible. However, they're still dealing with the same legacy and old systems, right? And some development teams, they're just exposing services just because they can, right? They're just building a REST interface on top of their legacy systems, and they're forgetting about setting the right security patterns. Perhaps they're not thinking on how they should be scaling their APIs the right way. They are losing visibility on who are the real users of those APIs, so that whenever they bring a new revision or a new update to their services, they lose control of the updates that they're making to those systems, right? In a sense, they're creating this API sprawl environment, right? So they are losing control of what's going on within the API program.
Yeah, it's a real problem. And you know, it's kind of like the more you create APIs, it is a benefit, but it creates lots of different security holes, and especially if you're doing them all differently. And so, you know, a lot of companies are looking at, you know, the typical IT method, which is big G governance. So I'm going to put rules, gates, and enforcements. You know, I'm going to make sure that I'm controlling every little thing and that there's approvals for releases and lots of manual reviews. that are companies with big documents and also a lot of different time spent on aligning and corporate politics. So, this is kind of a problem, Ruben, right? So it's like, we've got all these security concerns, we've got to go fast, but because of that security, now we have this big cop in the middle, right? And that can be really detrimental. And so if you look at, from a standpoint, let's say we've got an API team, they've already ready to release their APIs or build their APIs. They start out happy, but they get to this first standpoint, which is they have an architecture review. So now that's a speed bump. Then they have to go to API design reviews. Someone has to make sure that they're using the right approach and they're using reusable and making sure they have the right policies in there. Or they have an internal standards review. And then finally, when they go to deploy, there's a whole bunch of checklists that they never were aware of. And so what happens in these 4 speed bumps? There's tons of rework within the cycle. And so if you're a smart team, you're going to prepare in advance and you're going to get all your documents ready. But this process is probably such a headache that you start to bundle all of your APIs together. So rather than getting 1 approved, I'm going to put 20 or 30. And so pretty soon we're back to waterfall. The other thing is I know some of the loopholes. I know I have relationships. I know people, and I know what they're kind of looking for, or they know me. So I might just sidestep this process. And in the end, what happens there? We basically, something that we designed to keep us secure is now people have found a loophole and found a path of least resistance. So this is a real bad problem, right? So it's like there's no good way to solve this, right, Ruben? I mean, I think that's the challenge where we are today.
I mean, there are different ways of how we can address this. We can see this as a process-driven solution, or perhaps making a mix, including as part of the mix the right tool for you to be able to address these issues.
Yeah. And so before we get into tools, I think as technologists, we always think about how can we use tools. I think the most important thing that we find with our customers and organizations, it's a mindset shift first. And so at Apigee, we call it API Governance 2.0. And we wrote this manifesto working with hundreds of customers worldwide. And we've seen their programs grow based on this kind of mindset. And so the first one is really around empowering and enabling over enforcement, right? How can I help my API teams? Give them the tools, give them knowledge, give them the ability to make decisions, right? Then the second is guidance and support over policing. The third is accelerating progress over slowing change. So really, it's a dynamic, right? I'm not focused on how can I overturn everything and look at it. I really want to focus on speed. What can I do to keep these teams going fast? And last is this relinquishing of a centralized control. So trust and federation over centralized control. And I think trust is not something that you can just basically say, trust me. You have to build trust into your system. So that's the cornerstone, I think, of the mindset change, this manifesto of governance 2.0. And so that really means, a lot of teams, they call them API centers of excellence. But what we want people to shift to is this API center of enablement. And so what does that look like? I think really quickly, big G governance versus little g culture. That's really the shift in terms of big G governance to this governance 2.0. That means I'm going from rules to gates and enforcements to principles, standards, and empowerment. I used to have top-down design and planning and big waterfall. Now I have separation of concerns. I have an enterprise concern. I allow teams to do what they need to do. I'm going from approvals for releases to criteria-based and continuous releases. I want to make people to understand what it means to pass go and to hit the criteria so that they can always release constantly at their speed. And I'm not going to do manual and analog processes. I'm going to look at how I can create self-service through automation and tooling. And I'm going to enforce community knowledge and community documentation rather than centralized Word documents. And then the last couple too, I'm going to have cross-functional teams and coaches. I'm not going to have distinct big handovers from teams, which is very core to the way of agile thinking, same thing as governance 2.0. And instead of spending all this time aligning and building corporate politics, I'm going to focus on building tools, CI/CD, to help the teams go faster so that they're essentially using efficiency-based tools rather than alignment and time spent in wasted meetings and politics. If I have that, I have this API Governance 2.0, Ruben. Let's take a look at the process that we have today. There's 4 points: API architecture, design, right, standards, and then deployment and in live. So how can we use technology in this case? How can we apply the principles of API 2.0 to all 4 of these things? Yeah, can we let's do that and try to solve this problem together.
Definitely. So, from an architecture standpoint, perhaps you might want to look into a way to standardize globally and across all your existing architecture. Doesn't matter if if you are deploying in a cloud or multiple cloud providers, or even on premises. You want to build a layer of abstraction on top of your existing services, so that you can enforce and not only enforce but decouple common security patterns from your existing system. So, from your existing APIs, right? So that you're going to be able to build this layer of abstraction, and essentially this will become a shield that is gonna protect both the interactions from your existing API consumers, and also the secure interactions between this platform and your backend systems. By setting up this layer of abstraction, you're going to be able to standardize all your security patterns and make sure that they are enforced correctly.
Perfect. So if I'm an API developer, I deploy an API to the API platform. It's I'm automatically going to gain the benefits of threat protection, the security, and the patterns that you're talking about. So I'm essentially kind of deploying on a trusted platform.
That is correct. So essentially, you're building secure interactions between your API consumers and your backend systems through a standardized shield or layer of abstraction in a API platform.
What are some of the examples of the patterns that you're talking about, Ruben?
So perhaps from a network perspective, you're going to be building trust relationship within the platform and your backend systems. Perhaps you're already using an existing security pattern. So the only thing you need to do is to set up a really simple trust relationship between the API platform and your existing backend systems. Perhaps you can build up a very simple neutral TLS setup. Perhaps if you're looking into token-based authentication mechanisms, that's something you can build upon. However, if you want to reuse what you already have, you can do it, and then you can keep progressing those patterns so that you can start standardizing once new projects come in, right? Okay. And the same story goes on the consumer relationship, right? Perhaps your organization might be thinking on setting up OAuth as a standard across the board. That's something that you can enforce at this layer.
Perfect. So I've got my API management set up now. I've got the security architecture in place. You talked a little bit about OAuth and security. Can you tell me a little bit more about, now let's dive in. I've got a couple of APIs.
Definitely. So usually, from a development standpoint, this happens too often, right? Each and every time you have to expose a new service, we developers need to sometimes get too creative and start setting up new security patterns, so new ways to secure our project or APIs, right? And for each and every project, we have to set up that pattern. However, there's a best way to do it. So once you build this layer of abstraction, perhaps you can also start decoupling these patterns, so that no longer the developer is going to be the developer task to have to come up with a new security pattern. Then essentially, after decoupling these patterns, you're essentially creating shareable libraries, right? And in this case, you can decouple an authentication and authorization shareable library through a policy, right?
Perfect.
So now the developer doesn't have to come up with all this, and then he can really focus on the business value that he's going to be exposing through an API.
Yeah, we love creativity, but not when it comes to security, right?
That is correct.
We want to build best practice and standardize.
Exactly. So, and remember, security is not all about just authentication and authorization. Perhaps you want to protect your APIs against DDoS attacks, or perhaps against content-based attacks. That's something that, again, is great that you're thinking of on those different issues. However, you just need to have to come up with those patterns once, and perhaps you're the person in charge of designing or identifying those patterns is a completely different stakeholder than from a developer standpoint, right? Perhaps within your own organization, you already have a security team that is in charge of making sure these patterns are applied correctly throughout all the APIs that you're going to be exposing. So you will need to have the right tool that it will enable you to have this separation of duties, right? The developer team, the API team will focus on the real business value that are going to be exposing through APIs. And of course, the security stakeholders are going to treat these shared security policies as a non-functional requirement, right? Although they are very important, you just need to come up with them once, and then you don't have to worry about them. You can keep redeploying new APIs, and you don't need to do all the revalidation process for these specific aspects of your releases.
Right. So it's almost like the path of least resistance. If I'm a developer and I'm creating APIs, I mean, you're actually making my life a little easier, right? I just got to focus on the request and response of the payload and the business logic there. But all the stuff around the shared security policies is no longer a thing that I have to be concerned with. If I deploy on the API platform, I'm automatically getting some of these policies for free. They're added already, right?
That is correct, and it's still you might want to have the right tool, just because you will still want to have certain level of flexibility. Perhaps you're gonna come up with specific parameters that are gonna be able to let the API team to decide which rate or quotas you're gonna be applying per API or API product. So again, you still want to have that separation of concerns in regards of policy enforcement. However, there are certain levels of parameterizing options you might want to leave to be the responsibility of the API team or even a business team.
Nice. So I get that flexibility, and I also, anybody who uses the platform says, hey, security's already been involved. They've actually been part of the architecture of the policies even that are being added, which is really great.
Remember, we're talking about artifacts here. So every software product nowadays have to go through a software development lifecycle. And the best way to do all these releases is through an agile process, right? So
Yep.
Thinking in terms of an API platform and everything that you're going to be deploying within this tool, we're thinking in configuration terms. So usually we have to treat these configuration artifacts as if they were any other software artifact, right? So they're going to have a release process. They're going to have specific stages where you might want to run some quality checks, and you're gonna want to make sure that you're applying and making sure the right security policies are being enforced even before deploying this configuration into the platform, right? After these configuration artifacts are deployed into the platform, you want to make sure that even though they were already pre-validated, once you deploy them, then you can rerun some tests to be able to have a full integration test results from the consumer side all the way to your backend system. So again, you will have even multiple security. These kind of life cycles will enable you to have multiple security checks before deploying and even after deploying.
Nice. So there's a lot of tools in the CI/CD pipeline that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, definitely. And the beauty of it is that every customer is different, and as well, every customer might be in a different stage in regards of the maturity level on using agile software development life cycles and pipelines.
Yep.
So most organizations want to be able to reuse what they already got. Right? You don't want to get a platform that is going to force you to choose a specific set of tools, right? You want to have flexibility. So, and that's great from a developer standpoint, right? You don't need to rethink the wheel. If you're already used to handle Java source code, most likely you're going to be relating very often to Maven, right? So you might want to have an option for you to be able to deploy configuration artifacts through Maven. So that's something that Apigee provides for our customers. So another thing, if you're perhaps a web developer, you might be more comfortable using JavaScript-based tools. So also Apigee offers some plugins for you to be able to deploy configuration artifacts into the platform using JavaScript plugins. And again, the sky is the limit. If you're already using a CI/CD orchestrator such as Jenkins, that's something that you can reuse and build a pipeline for all these artifacts that you're going to be pushing into the platform. Thinking about source control, each and every major organization that handles software development, of course, they might have chosen a specific version of or a specific product for source control. So that's something that is really standard in the industry, and actually we promote it as a best practice also for our configuration artifacts.
So Apigee is really flexible, right? We can adapt to all these tools. And I think that back to the security point is we see a lot of companies who are using and adding like linting tools. They're adding their security testing tools. They're adding custom like regular expressions and other types of quality checks right into the CI/CD pipeline, right? So when they're deploying their APIs to this CI/CD process, it's actually going through additional checks, both security, compliance, and any other kind of standards that they're trying to govern, right? That's sort of the power of the CI/CD, is that they're mastering and they're automating it through this deployment process.
That is correct.
Yeah. So what happens about now that I'm live? Like, what can we do about monitoring?
So once your APIs are exposed to the public, of course, you might want to still be able to monitor to monitor what's going on within your API program, right? You want to be able to address specific threats or even malicious users that might be well, trying to break your existing systems or trying to steal your information, right? So you want to have a platform that is going to be able to, will allow you to define monitoring alerts, right? And then for you to be able to investigate what's going on into the platform in real time and act upon it, right? So this is something that is pivotal for any kind of platform, and of course, is very important for a platform that is going to be sitting right in the middle within your API consumers and your backend systems.
Yeah, sounds like a really good tool to have, especially when I have thousands of APIs or hundreds, and I really don't know kind of like how much protection I have, and if people have been deploying in the past and I haven't been able to manage them, this is a great way to monitor. So let's take a look at let's take a look at some of these things in action. So Ruben's going to open up Apigee. We're going to take a look at when we talk about enterprise policies and how we're securing them and reusing them. Ruben's going to show that. We're going to show you the developer experience, which is, from a developer standpoint, how does that look like? And then we just talked about monitoring security. So let's take a look at those dashboards that are coming out of the box from Apigee. So let's get this going and let's take a look at the demo.
The first time you're going to be logging into the platform, this is the screen that you're going to see. Okay, the Apigee Edge platform is within the Apigee Edge platform. Essentially, you're going to be deploying configuration artifacts, right? Today, we're going to be showing two different configuration artifacts. We're going to be showing API proxies and also share flows. Okay, so let's get going. So I'm going to click over here in API proxies. Over here, each and every of these entries that you see on the screen, it represents an API proxy. An API proxy essentially is a configuration artifact that will allow you to augment the capabilities of the endpoints that you're exposing through the platform. Some examples of these augmentation capabilities. Perhaps you're thinking of the forces security patterns, perhaps some lightweight mediation, perhaps some traffic management. Those are the kind of patterns that you're going to be decoupling from your backend systems, and you want to enforce them within the platform. Okay, so I already prepared some APIs beforehand. Okay, so we have some zip codes, payments, employees API. So I'm gonna start getting into the zip codes API. Okay,
right.
So once I get in, I'm gonna switch into the develop tab. So as you can see, this is a pretty straightforward API. We have two different endpoints exposed through my API, okay, zip codes and cities, okay? So now let's try it out.
Nice. Always want to make some zip codes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Within the platform, you have well, from a API developer perspective, you will have the trace tool. The trace tool will enable you to have a memory picture of what's going on within the traffic flow of your API. So the only thing that I need to do is to start a trace session. Okay. Once I start it, I can send over a transaction. Okay. I'm gonna hit send. And immediately I'm getting a 401. So as you can see, I'm enforcing two different policies. One of them is a DDoS protection policy, and the second one is a verify API key policy. But wait a minute, if I go back to my develop tab, I don't see any policy being enforced in my flows. I see if I take a look into the pre-flow, I see no policy. If I get into the cities resource, I see no policy. I have a policy defined here, but however, this little broken link image here is telling me that it's not attaching to my flow. So what's going on? Who's enforcing those APIs? Well, me as an API developer within my organization, I only have this development view for my API. However, someone up in the chain of command within my organization is already enforcing security policies globally. Let's take a look at that. So now I'm going to switch roles, and now I'm going to become Ruben Gonzalez, the security stakeholder, right? Me as a security stakeholder, I will have access to a different configuration artifact called share flows. Okay, so over here within share flows, I already have one that is defined as share flow enterprise security. So let's take a look at it. Okay, within the share flows, I also have a develop tab. So you should think of share flows as shareable libraries. Essentially, you're going to be coming up with patterns, and these patterns are essentially policies that are attached together, right, within an execution flow. So in this case, I have a single flow, and this is the policies I already have pre-attached. Okay, so as you can see, well, we call it enterprise security because mostly all these policies are going to be addressing security scenarios, right?
Mhm.
So in this case, this first policy is making sure that our backends are going to be protected against DDoS attacks, and we are allowing a rate of 100 transactions per second, right? Within the second policy, I'm enforcing a very simple authentication mechanism, which is verify API key, right? However, the Apigee platform is not limited to this simple security pattern. Actually, remember, we offer multiple security policies. So let's take a look at those at that category. Okay, so if I click over here in Add Policy, I'm gonna take you're gonna be able to see the three main categories for our out-of-the-box policies. So if we take a look at the security policies, you're gonna be able to see, well, there are multiple ones, right? And within the platform, let's say if you're interested in using a token-based mechanism to authenticate each and every API call, of course, you can within the platform you can use JOT tokens, JWT tokens. You can use SAML assertions, for example. You can use encrypted tokens. You can use basic authentication. If you're looking forward to enforce OAuth across the board, of course, you can do that as well. Okay, so there are multiple options within the platform, and of course, there's a lot of flexibility for you to choose and enforce the right pattern depending on your business. Okay.
Nice.
Awesome. So again, there are multiple ones. Remember, security is not about just authorization on authentication. Perhaps you may also want to restrict and protect your backend systems against content-based attacks. So these two policies, these two next policies address exactly that. So this first one protects your backend systems against SQL injection attacks, and this second one is protecting your backend systems against code injection attacks.
Nice.
Makes sense. So now that me as a security stakeholder define this share function within my organization, then there's an extra way I can make sure that no one can do anything about it and it's going to be enforced globally. And for that, we're going to be using our global environment configuration, right? And within our environments, we're going to have what we call flow hooks. So there are three main flow hooks in an environment within an Apigee Edge organization, right? So essentially, flow hooks are execution points for the interactions between the API consumer and the platform, and of course the platform and the backend systems. But these execution points are exactly at the edges, meaning the developer will not be able to touch these edges, right? These are policies and sections that are enforced globally. Okay, so I'm going to switch environment here. I'm going to switch to my development environment. And as you can see, well, here it is. My global enterprise security policy is being enforced at the pre-proxy. The pre-proxy flow hooks is guaranteed to execute before the transaction reaches your API proxy. Therefore, the API developer will not be able to manage or to change this setting.
Nice. So any API deployed to the test environment is going to go through these enterprise security policies that you just said in the pre-proxy, right?
That is correct.
And I don't have to do anything as a developer to do that, which is, I think, a big difference from big G governance where you give somebody a document or you say, this is a process and we're going to check. There's nothing here, right? You deploy, it'll automatically happen.
Exactly. Now the developer is going to be able to focus on really defining a nice RESTful contract for their APIs. And now they're going to be able to expose those APIs in a very nice way, and they don't have to worry and to come up or to get too creative with a security pattern.
Yeah, perfect. And I see you also have a post flow there too. So that means like if you have a logging policy or any other things that you want to do after you get the response back, we see a lot in the post target as well, right?
Now we know that our security stakeholder, me as Ruben Gonzalez as a security stakeholder, I'm able to enforce these kind of policies globally. Now that you're going to be able also to deploy new APIs without having to worry about all these security patterns. Now let's take a look at our monitoring dashboard. So within the platform, remember, you will have the ability to set up some rules and for you to be able to validate and make sure that you're going to be able to monitor and investigate specific security scenarios that me as a stakeholder I'm going to be interested in. Okay, so let's take a look to our API monitoring dashboard. So over here, you're going to be able to define your own alerts, right? And these alerts are based on metadata that is captured by the platform in real time for each and every transaction that is going through. Okay, so let's take a look to our alerts that we already predefined. Okay, so now a common use case for a security stakeholder is going to be, well, I'm going to be interested in failed authentication attempts. I'm going to make sure that, well, I'm not being attacked, or or a malicious user is not trying to overwhelm my authorization services, right? So in this case, I'm going to create a new alert. In this case, this alert is going to be called unauthorized access. Okay, it's going to be deployed in the test environment. Okay, and I'm going to set up some conditions. So initially, we're going to set up a basic metric, which is going to be the status code. And as me as a security stakeholder, I'm going to be very interested in 401s, because this error relates to unauthorized access. Right now, let's define a threshold. In this case, I'm going to define the threshold as a count, and I'm only going to allow 10 unauthorized attempts every 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to add an extra dimension. Okay, in this case, I'm going to select the API proxies as my dimension, right? And this condition is going to be applied to all available API proxies within an environment. Remember, ultimately, the API platform sits on top of all your existing backend system. Doesn't matter where they are deployed, right? So you want the right tool for you to be able to manage these flexible and deployments, right? In this case, I'm able to scope down conditions to the API level. However, this condition is a global. This filter is a global one that is going to be applied throughout all the available APIs in the environment, right? And also, it's going to be applied throughout all available regions within my organization. Remember, you want the solution that can be deployed in multiple environments. Okay, so now that I set up my conditions, I'm going to be able to create notification channels. Okay, within my alert, I can define multiple notification channels. In this case, we support 4 main channels, which is going to be email, Slack, and this is a very common tool that nowadays DevOps teams use all the time. If you already have PagerDuty, you can integrate that very easily. Or even if you have a completely different setup or custom setup for you to be able to be notified, of course, we can integrate to that using a webhook. Okay, so as you can see, Ray, there's a lot of flexibility how not only ops teams but also security stakeholders are going to be able to monitor specific patterns and react accordingly in real time.
Nice. So it's kind of a nice rules engine to find out issues and proactively notify. It's great.
Exactly.
What about from a security standpoint? You mentioned the security dashboards and looking at policies and seeing if APIs were adhering to that.
Yeah, remember we discussed multiple approaches. We mentioned security from a design standpoint, from a non-functional requirement standpoint. We also talked about automation, how you can perform specific checks even before deploying your API proxy configuration. But now let's talk about once your APIs are deployed, then how do you make sure that you're going to be able to audit what's going on in the API proxies that your developers are deploying into the platform. And for that, we're going to be using our security reporting capabilities. Okay, let's take a look to our configuration dashboard. So over here, this is a single view of which policies are being enforced or used within an environment. Okay, in this case, I'm going to switch to the test environment. Actually, I already have another environment prepared for you guys, because this one will have way more APIs than the ones that we were working.
Oh, there's a lot here. Yeah.
Exactly. So in this case, as you can see, this is a single point of view of what's going on each and every APIs that is being deployed. Okay. So in this case, I'm able to see if these APIs are receiving traffic from a secure virtual host, meaning all the traffic is being encrypted or not. Okay. Also, in this case, you're going to see multiple policies categories that are being applied or used within an API proxy. In this case, if I click on the Istio auth proxy, I'm making sure that, well, specific security policies are being enforced. Also, Remember, security is not about authentication and authorization, but also about making sure that, well, if someone is deploying some custom code within your API proxy configuration, you want to make sure that, well, this developer is not using any strange JavaScript libraries, for instance, right? So you want to make sure that security checks were enforced even before deploying, and once deployed, that nothing has changed.
Okay. So this is pretty cool. So if I look at all this, I can just by looking at it say BO authentication and this consents API. There's no security policies there against those.
That is correct, and that's a big no-no. If me as a security stakeholder, I would say, well, what went wrong? Who green-lighted the deployment of that proxy? What's going on? I can block it immediately.
Yeah, let's go figure that out. Nice. So this is really kind of a nice comprehensive view. It's really a sort of bird's eye view of all the APIs and what security policies they're using. That's awesome, Ruben. Thank you. With all that information that we saw, so we saw the enterprise policies being enforced automatically. We understood a little bit about the API platform, and we talked about where we can apply rules and automation into all of this. So let's take a look back at our use case. So we've got our API team. They're really happy. But they're about to be unhappy because they're going to hit all these speed bumps, right? These big 4 speed bumps that we have here. So if we used our automation, our governance 2.0 approach, and we use this API management function, what would happen? So let's take the first step, architecture review. I would say, Ruben, that we don't need an architecture review at this point, right? If we already stood up Apigee, we've got API management platform, I would say the architecture reviews happen. We've stood up the API management platform. Any new API doesn't have to do another review.
That is correct. So now remember, the whole point of it is for you to go to decouple of these patterns and apply them globally.
Perfect. So that saves us a lot of time for the API team. So they're still happy at this point. What about on API design? So if I go to API design and I'm already putting in the policies, or actually I didn't have to, if I'm already deploying APIs, and the policies are being automatically enforced through those flow hooks that you showed us. Security has already signed off. I mean, at this point, the only other thing is really around my payload, right? So I would say at this point, anything that I've deployed is already built in at runtime. So again, I have saved some time there as well on the API design front. Right?
That is correct. Even before deploying and even after deploying, you can make sure that nothing is going to go on, even through automation or through the tool.
Nice. Okay, and then I'm about to do, a pull request. I have my tech lead's going to take a look at, my code. Good news is if I deploy in this new governance 2.0, and if we put in LinkedIn tools, we've actually done other security call outs to something like a check marks or something, or any other kind of regular expressions, I'd say at this point for internal standards review, I've already automated it per build, right? So as a developer, I know kind of what I'm going to be tested against. I can run it, during my build time, and I can see the results. So again, I would say, Ruben, I'm going to put an X here. We don't have to hit that speed bump anymore for the internal standards review as well. What do you think?
Exactly. Again, through either through a tool or automation, you can make sure that, well, you're working with the right patterns, and you're going to be able to see the reports.
Nice. So my rework cycle has already gone down by a lot. So what about the last one? I'm going to hit this deployment. I'm talking to the ops teams. Certainly, I think, given most companies and organizations we worked with, there's probably still a need for somebody to manually hit the button just to make sure things are right. But, from essentially providing the information and generating the report about what's been done, I would say that, we can generate these results automatically and get them to the ops folks so that they can do a final approval. So maybe not a full 2 slashes, but I would say we probably cut that time down in about half or even more by auto-generating for ops and getting that final approval on the deployment. What would you say to that, Ruben?
Yeah, it might change depending on the industry. There are some folks out there that might be might be used to have many more checks before deploying something into production. Perhaps if you're into financial industry, perhaps you're going to have way more stages, even the ones that we already covered here today. Mm-hmm. So it changes a lot, and also changes depending on the level of the maturity level for your DevOps teams.
Yeah, it certainly changes. But I think in general, what we see here is that you're reducing a lot of that effort that a lot of teams have already had to incur because of the way governance was set up before, right? So with these modern tools, we've totally been able to launch a lot faster. And I think the best part is most of this is built into the process, right? So the design is built in, the quality, the security, and the testing is built into the development lifecycle rather at the end, you know? That's the part that is also saving us a ton of rework and ton of wasted time that's been happening in the past. Let's recap, Ruben. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at the key takeaways for APIs. So you've got hundreds of APIs, maybe thousands, and you've got to deliver them at speed, scale, and quality. You know, what's the top things that you need to consider? Number one is shift your thinking. API Governance 2.0 is about a center of enablement, not a center of excellence. You are not in command and control. You're there to enable and empower the API teams within the lines of business, within your enterprise, to go faster, and you help them get there with real quality tools. The second is architect security upfront with an API management platform, something like Apigee. When we build APIs, when we build that management platform with the API, with Apigee, we're working with security. You've got security involved in the design of the architecture. That ensures a trusted platform setup from day one. The third, in what Ruben has showed you around centralizing those security policies, you know, you no longer have to make it an obligation for every developer to do these things. Now you can centralize. That creates a separation of concern. Let security in, let them be part of the enforcement of these policies. And not only is it about setting the policy, it's about including them at runtime. You actually don't have to give anybody documents. Anytime you deploy an API, automatically built into the runtime. That's a real powerful governance enforcement right there. And it also makes the lives of the developers easy because they don't have to worry about it. You know, that's a nice check there. So what's the fourth one? Standardize the inclusion of enterprise policies. So whenever you started to create these security policies and you standardize them, you're also looking at ways on how to automatically produce more policies that might protect the company from other things. So it's not just about security, but it's also about you know, SQL injections or threats or quotas or traffic management policies that might be important to include at an enterprise level. So look for ways to standardize more of that and reduce the developer load. And then last of all, you know, there was lots of tools that Apigee can work with, automate your QA and your compliance. So include that. That's really sort of that last mile in terms of development. You know, build quality into your pipeline, use the CI/CD, automate it, and include standards and compliance checks in your CI/CD pipeline. So with all of that, I think you know, we've kind of captured some of the key ways for teams that we've seen produce APIs at speed, scale, and quality. That's really following the Governance 2.0 method and leveraging the Apigee management platform. If you're interested in all of this, I would invite you to get started. If you're already an Apigee customer, just visit and take a look at our docs page. We'll post this up in our resources. And if you're new to Apigee, you could get started right away with a free trial of Apigee Edge. Just follow that link and see how easy it is. I mean, you saw Ruben use the tool. You see him. Some of it's like, you know, essentially using drag and drop features. And we have APIs from Apigee that allow you to do a lot of that, you know, from your IDE or other applications that you're using. So it's a really easy and quick start. So with that, we're getting close to the end of our webinar session. I'd like to take a look and see if any questions that we have out there from the audience to answer. And let me take a look. And yeah, we have a couple. So let's get started. What are the first question? What types of roles and skill sets are needed to develop this level of automation?
I would say that it varies a lot depending on the maturity level within a developer team. So if you're already leaning towards agile software development life cycles and already looking into automation and building a pipeline for your software artifacts, then moving into this approach of deploying configuration artifacts into the platform is going to be very easy because you're going to be able to reuse whatever you already have. However, if you're just starting getting to know agile software development life cycles, then you can adopt something very simple, very easily within the platform, right? Just because we're talking about configuration is going to be way easier to understand and set up from zero.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. And then let's take a look at the next question we've got. This is a good one. I think I was thinking this too as we start. My company has several different businesses and they have different types of security, regulatory, and compliance requirements. Can I really make one global set of policies? What do you think, Ruben?
Oh, you can definitely do. However, depending on the size of your organization, you might have to come up with multiple security patterns. Remember, and it all comes down to what you just said, right? What kind of requirements you're getting and how you're going to be enforcing them. So yeah, definitely you can define global patterns. However, you might still want to have that separation of duties, that separation of concerns, so that the developer doesn't have to worry about those patterns, and then someone is going to be able to enforce those patterns globally. It doesn't that someone might be related to a business unit, to a project, not essentially global at the whole organization, depending on the size of the organization, of course.
And so with shared flows, you can create those reusable, but you don't have to enforce it globally. You can make them easy for teams to add as well. And there's a lot of flexibility in instantiate different variables into policies.
Exactly. You can either give the option to developers to actually enforce that policy if you want to and do some checks before deployment, or you can enforce them globally. Again, there are different ways to do it, but the beauty of the Apigee platform is that you do have those options. You can build your own custom way of enforcing these policies and onboarding new developers so that they understand how they're being applied.
Okay, great. I see another question here. I think we've kind of covered it, but I think it's a really good question just to reinforce again. The question is, does Apigee provide any tools for CI/CD, code quality, or test automation?
So yeah, remember, everything that you saw today in the demo, everything from the clicks I did, from the developer view, everything, there's an API behind it. So the Apigee platform has been built for it to be extensible, right? So our customers use Maven plugins for them to be able to deploy configuration artifacts. They use JavaScript tools to deploy, and also to test custom code that they deploy within the platform. So out there, you will have multiple options, and of course, we also have a very strong community of developers, right? All our customers are always engaging with us and also setting up some questions in our Apigee community. And of course, there's a lot of knowledge out there, and a lot of open source solutions that even between customers they start sharing and reuse and contributing.
Perfect. It's certainly a broad community to leverage within Apigee and outside. So number 4, in terms of the question, how big is the center of enablement team? First of all, thank you for using that language and starting to think about that. Center of enablement team we see varies, but we generally see a small group within the central team focused on evangelism, setting standards, and coaching and supporting others. We're looking at probably a handful of people in terms of the center enablement. From there, we see it varying in terms of how many API teams you're supporting. If you've got 10 or hundreds of API teams, obviously your center of enablement is probably going to have to scale up, but over time, right? So I don't think this is about creating a big team. It's really created a central team to set the standards and start to coach and enable other teams to grow quickly. And there's I think this is the last question we've gotten. It's a great question to end with. The question is, do I need a dedicated security person on the API governance team? What do you think, Ruben?
That's a very interesting question. Most likely, there's someone within your organization, and you're going to get to meet him once you try to deploy something into production. Yeah. Most likely, and again, this varies as well on the sizes of our organizations. However, sometimes if your team is too small, or organization is too small, then most likely the developer will share that responsibility. However, the best practice is, of course, from a security standpoint, to have that separation of duties, right? So that then someone can focus only in the right security patterns, and the developers can focus on the real business value that you want to expose.
Yeah. And so if we have that separation of concerns, I'd say when you start out with setting up your API management platform, this is the perfect time to invite the security person to the table, right? Let's not meet them at the very end, like Ruben said. I think let's make friends from the very beginning and have security at the table, designing and architecting the platform with us together, and then build those policies and the approach and quality into the platform and into basically every API that gets deployed. And so with that, I think that's the end of our webcast. I hope you guys got a lot out of this webcast, and thank you all for taking the time and joining with Ruben and I today. Thank you all.
Thank you all, guys.